Before we begin, this video is sponsored by Vezi. Now that winter is upon us, wind, rain, sleet and snow are potentially unavoidable depending on your region, and specifically for myself, living in Ireland at this time of year,
it's always wet!
Thankfully, I've been using Vezi footwear for over a year now as the perfect alternative to big, heavy, sweaty boots and shoes that practically disintegrate when they touch water. The unbelievable brilliance of Vezis is that they're an all-year-round seasonal shoe uniquely knitted with a Dymatex material that not only keeps your feet dry and warm depending on the climate, but they are incredibly breathable, ultra-lightweight, and just insanely comfortable to wear. When I take Barney out in wet, windy weather, Vezis make me fearless of puddles and mud because I've tested the waterproof design more times than I care to admit, and I've never once had even a single drop of water seep through, which is especially handy when it comes to cleaning them. If you're feeling super adventurous, I personally recommend Vezi's recently launched Everyday Move shoes because they have a really good support for walking on trickier terrain, which is great for me because Barney does not like to stick to the main path. My only issue is that despite my dad being usually very cynical about branded shoes, likes to wear them when he goes golfing, and so there's typically an argument as to who gets to wear them. Sustainably made with less material and water waste and with no animal byproducts, making them 100% vegan, if you want a soft, stylish shoe for every occasion, check out the link below and use my code to get $25 off your Vezi shoes, and please let me know which ones you get. Also, get up to 30% off select Vezi Vault items. The Amityville horror is the subject of one of the most notorious and controversial alleged hauntings in American history that I'm sure many of you have heard of in some capacity. As a brief overview, the story goes that in December 1975, the Lutz family, consisting of George, Kathy, and their 3 children, moved into 112 Ocean Avenue, Amityville, Long Island, New York, where 13 months prior, Ronald DeFeo Jr. shot and killed his parents and 4 siblings in cold blood under relatively unclear circumstances. Various sources suggest his motive ranged from drug use to life insurance fraud to unspecified mental illness, the latter of which receiving the most attention as he supposedly claimed at one point to have heard voices telling him to kill his family. The Lutzes simply claimed that in their short time living there, they experienced recurring supernatural occurrences and sold the rights to their story to Jay Anson, who wrote a 1977 book based on their experiences, which, while claimed to be an authentic true story, led to a lot of suspicion about how much of it was embellished or just utter bollocks. The real story is shrouded in many conflicting, contradicting, and baffling accounts from not only the parties involved, but also the influence of the media, conspiracy theorists, paranormal investigators, and every other opportunist you can think of, leading to immediate scrutiny over its entire validity, with the Lutzes even going as far as to sue several individuals and media outlets for basically defaming them. However, we're not here to talk about the real Lutz family, no. Instead, we're here to talk about the inevitable 1979 fictional film that spawned out of it, which at least showed some acknowledgement of respect to the actualities by not just straight up claiming to be true. Now, let me be clear, I'm not a fan of fictional stories that sensationalize and exploit harrowing real-life tragedies without some sort of transparent or thoughtful artistic reason, because not only is it a matter of respecting the victims, but as you can see in today's climate, it's unfortunately very easy to perpetuate misinformation. The 1979 film is a work of fiction based on a work of fiction based on a real event. The only thing we know for certain is that yes, Ronald DeFeo Jr. did murder his family, and the Lutzes did leave the house scared shitless. But everything else is all hearsay, so going into the film, I'm confident you can all think for yourselves. Despite scathing reviews, the 1979 film became one of the most profitable independent productions of the era, largely due to not only its connection to a heavily publicized story, but it took a few notes from William Friedkin's profoundly popular and also controversial supernatural horror, The Exorcist. Hell, in an interview with Score magazine, Amityville's composer Lalo Schifrin actually wrote an original 6-minute score for the Exorcist trailer, but it was later rejected by Friedkin and Warner Brothers due to it supposedly being too intense and unconventional. I would personally love to hear it because Amityville's score is arguably one of its defining features, so much so it was actually nominated for an Academy Award, which shockingly was the one award The Exorcist did not get nominated for. Anyway, despite this, Amityville and The Exorcist aren't really two films I would appropriately compare with each other because one is a simple haunted house story and the other is this richly introspective juggernaut about spirituality, morality, and mortality. At most, the one loose similarity is how both of them deal with the bureaucracy of the church, as Amityville has a subplot involving a priest whose faith is challenged by his experiences in the house, but I'll come back to this later. Lastly, before we dive into the finer details, I will address the 2005 remake at the end, but generally speaking, for those who won't make it that far, it's fine. That is, if you can overlook its egregiously offensive portrayal of the subject matter. It basically takes the relatively ambiguous nature of the original, as we'll come to see, and aims for a much more thoroughly morbid and grotesque stylization that, I'll admit, caught me off guard at times. As always, please leave your thoughts in the comments below as we go along to help feed the algorithm gods, because YouTube really doesn't like pushing horror content these days. And now, let's enter the world of the Amityville horror. So, as you might expect from a conventional 70s haunted house story, the Amityville horror is pretty old school in terms of supernatural cliches and tropes common to the genre, yet once you get past all the creaking floorboards and moving objects, the execution can be genuinely unnerving at times. This might be an odd way to describe it, but it's very atmospherically violent, in that there's this really aggressive, angry, hateful energy that manifests throughout the house that increasingly escalates as the more overt supernatural stuff begins to take shape. At first, the film smartly plays into the skepticism of the actual Lutz story, by treating almost all the eerie events as rationally explainable, or so mundane and insignificant that you begin to question if the house is actually haunted. However, being a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes, of course the house is eventually proven to be haunted. Although, with that said, the ultimate threat, as we'll call it, does go largely unexplained, as the story is approached as a sort of quasi-realistic day-in-the-life family drama that sometimes feels like a reconstruction of ambiguous events, with a lot of liberties and exaggerations that ultimately fuel the real controversy.
Half the killers in this country say the same thing. The voices. The voices told me to do.
But I heard them, Father! I heard voices!
If I was to say the Amityville horror did something unique with the haunted house subgenre that came out of the 60s, it does have a certain grittiness to it, in how it focuses more on each individual character's reaction to what they see or experience around the house. Like I said, the first half doesn't really portray the house as haunted, just the feeling that it's haunted, or at the very least, something isn't quite right about it. Specifically, there's this implication that the house can subconsciously communicate and influence all those who enter, such as having the daughter befriend a ghostly girl called Jody, whom we never see, giving one of George's friends a sudden need to enter the house's basement, which will make sense later, attacking the babysitter out of genre obligation, I guess, causing Kathy's religious aunt to become sick and smartly bail the fuck out of there, attacking the priest sent to bless the house with a swarm of flies, and most significantly, seemingly possessing George into feeding its violent urge. Now, that is a lot to unpack, but the main thing is that there's no big spooky ghost monster, at least not until the end. I don't know what the fuck that is, as every individual experience is treated purely as a personal subjective ordeal. For example, in the case of Father Delaney, he explicitly hears a voice violently telling him to get out, but for all we know, that's just in his head, and what follows is arguably the story's most tragic plot point.
Now, you haven't told us one thing that can't be written off as simple hysteria.
In The Exorcist, the main plot point is a priest going through a crisis of faith and eventually overcoming it when confronting the climactic demon. However, in the Amityville horror, it kinda subverts that crisis of faith, as it doesn't have a resolution. Father Delaney desperately seeks to return to the house to fight the evil, but he never does, largely due to the fact that the house supernaturally prevents him from ever returning to finish his blessing. Thematically, I think the point of it is to show the impact the house's evil ultimately has on those around it. It's almost like it curses anyone who enters, shattering them psychologically and spiritually.
Oh, Mother of God, I'm coming apart!
In fact, after the church dismisses his claims of evil, Father Delaney's close colleague compares his own time seeing the horrors of Vietnam with what Delaney claims to have experienced in the house.
My point is, Father, that I believe we create our own demons in our own minds.
I feel like I've heard this statement before, but I don't know from where, and I've got too much imposter syndrome to think I was witty enough to come up with it, but the Amityville horror is like the Michael Myers of haunted houses. The house is just pure evil, and that's it. There's no real logic or motive. It exists to cause harm and nothing more. It's a perpetual cycle of violence and destruction. Granted, there is a motive insinuated later in the film, but I'll deal with that in the later spoiler section. All of this is worth keeping in mind if you're curious enough to watch it. The Amityville horror is not only fairly bleak, but also anti-cathartic. It leaves you with this sinking feeling that we simply can't do anything about the evil that's tainted our world.
Maybe I am just chasing shadows.
If you could excuse me, please.
But a huge part of what makes this sense of inconsequentialism work is how it sustains this lingering first impression we have of the house following the tragic murders in the opening scene. I respect that the DeFeo murders are kept relatively vague following the opening, and instead sensitively treats the tragedy as a permanent thematic mark of sadness and anger that will never be cleansed. I think the film tries to use it as a way to show where the Lutz family anxiety and fear came from, as going back to Father Delaney's colleague's statement, the mind makes it so. We create our own fears based on what we believe, which is predominantly prevalent in all the religious characters in the film, including Kathy, who takes it upon herself to ensure the house is spiritually blessed, so to speak. While my interpretation is contradicted by the blatant reveal of the supernatural, all the human elements are consistent, in that we have this family, the church, and even the police hopelessly wandering about trying to make sense of such bizarre circumstances. As such, you could say there is a mature meditation on how we cope with such a harrowing tragedy when we don't have reason, logic, or answers to explain it. Unfortunately, however, the theme of unrest is later reduced to merely foreshadowing that George will eventually try to murder his family, as the film is still guilty of dwelling heavily on DeFeo supposedly hearing murderous voices in his head. After all, the big overarching dread established early in the story is George's increasing aggression and alienation that makes his violence seem inevitable.
Don't you have any good news?
The thing is, there's this constant and prominent motif of George trying to keep the house fire lit because he thinks it's always cold, and I read this as him somewhat feeding the house to keep its energy alive, and in return, he becomes more subservient to the house. I know that's a pretentious way to look at it, but when the scenes of him just chopping wood are more stressful than anything that happens in the house, his actions kinda stick with you. Now, I do want to talk about the climax more, so this is a warning for those looking to watch the film for themselves. So there's a bit of a misconception that George attempting to murder his family is the big dramatic payoff for the film, but I'm going to ruin it for you. It lasts like literally 2 or 3 minutes. It is an understatement to say it is underwhelming because it's quickly resolved by Kathy basically going up to George and going, "Oi, stop being a dick," and George is like, "Alright then," and they all just bail the fuck out of there. Yeah, the Amityville horror has a couple of dead ends, but again, if we compare it to Halloween, it's tonally similar in how the sudden, unexplained nature of everything technically makes it creepier. Granted, I admire that idea more in premise than in execution, even if, like I said, there are some genuinely scary moments elevated by the musical score. Now, just before we go into the major spoiler, I'm sure many of you have picked up on the climax sounding just a little similar to a small book that came out 2 years before Amityville called Stephen King's The Shining. In The Shining, the father Jack attempts to murder his family with a mallet after becoming increasingly psychotic from both cabin fever and interacting with the ghostly occupants at the hotel, who seemingly encourage him to kill his family. And with this scene being unique to the film, made me think King must have had some inspiration on it. Well, it turns out Stephen King did have a personal interpretation of the film that's referenced in the book Horror Film FAQ by John Kenneth MUIR. According to MUIR, King read into the subtext of the film as an allegory for a financial nightmare, given the persistent references to the stresses that overwhelm George throughout the story, such as paying for an expensive, if reasonably priced house, his accumulating debts, his business being investigated by the IRS, and just the general chaos of moving into a new home with his family.
You marry a dame with 3 kids, you buy a big house with mortgages up to your ass, you change your religion and you forget about business. Great. Really great.
In a way, he's basically having a violent nervous breakdown that's overcome by fighting back the supernatural urge with the true love he has for his family and wanting to do everything in his power to protect and provide for them. I guess when you think about it this way, it does add another layer to the film because the woodchopping scene, along with George neglecting his actual job, does provide a sort of toxic breadwinner motif, let's call it. But unfortunately, it's probably about time I address that big major spoiler I've been saving for now, so unless you want to watch the film for yourself, brace yourself because this is going to turn a few heads in questionable ways. When we talked about the Amityville horror having old school supernatural tropes and cliches, there is no bigger unsurprising surprise than the house being built on an ancient Native American burial ground. Yeah, you've definitely heard of this one before. Essentially, George's friend Caroline reveals that an alleged witch called John Ketchum was driven out of Salem many years before, and built his house on the land where the Lutzes currently live to, I guess, channel spiritual demonic energy or something like that. I mean, if that sounds bad, trust me, the remake makes it sound a hell of a lot worse.
Devil worship, death, sacrifice. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, it can only change forms.
And unless you want to poke that historical hornet's nest, that's really about it. The Amityville horror had a fairly influential legacy on establishing the modernized foundations for many of the haunted house films that followed.
Don't be such a big hardcore rationalist.
Oh, thank you very much for your cosmic views. Now do me a favor. Shut up!
For example, I consider Steven Spielberg and Tobe Hooper's incredible 1982 Poltergeist to be a fun, fantastical, and greatly self-aware improvement on several, if indeed questionable, concepts used in the Amityville film. And of course, let's not forget this story provided the precise framework for the Conjuring universe, which itself heavily sensationalized, embellished, and bullshitted many alleged true hauntings, particularly considering the involvement of the controversial paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren in the Amityville case. Alright, so before we finish, let's take some time to talk about the 2005 remake starring RYAN Reynolds, would you believe? Like almost every remake I follow up the original with, this version has a flashier, more bombastic visual style that caters to a younger, more impatient demographic. Unlike the original, there is no mystique, skepticism, or implication that the characters are just projecting their own psychological and spiritual fears onto the house. Right from the very beginning, it makes no attempt to respect the actualities and very shamelessly overindulges on the supernatural hijinks to ensure it is absolutely clear that the house is objectively haunted. But the thing is, this approach is honestly no surprise, given it was actually the second film in a series of Hollywood horror remakes and derivatives by Michael Bay's co-owned Platinum Dunes production company. In fact, believe it or not, this is the third Scott Costner screenplay I've covered this year, with the others being Platinum Dunes' remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the brilliantly underrated The Machinist. Compared to the original, which focused on the house's historical presence, the remake puts a remarkable emphasis on gore and violence, which I think may have had something to do with trying to capture the splatter zeitgeist spawned out of 2004's Saw. You see, the major narrative difference with the remake is that instead of keeping John Ketchum as some vague, ambiguous witchcraft conspiracy, it reveals that he imprisoned, tortured, and murdered Native Americans in a dungeon beneath the house, whose restless spirits now haunt the grounds, including Ketchum himself, who possesses George into killing his family. Okay, so, like I said in the beginning, I can accept a work of fiction that keeps its factual inspiration vague or separate enough as to not disrespect or misinform the truth. But holy shit does this remake not give a fuck about anyone's feelings. I would be lying if I said it didn't get under my skin in some ways, but fuck me, was this really necessary? Again, I can separate fact from fiction, but this is a deeply misrepresented subject matter. What's worse is that the mysterious unseen Jodie from the original is straight up presented as one of the DeFeo siblings, which is just utter horseshit. There is no Jodie DeFeo. Talk about taking advantage of a harrowing tragedy. Anyway, with that said, there is another significantly less insensitive elephant, or well, pig in the room, RYAN Reynolds. Okay, I'm going to be real with you here. I cannot stand RYAN Reynolds' tacky Deadpool smartass shtick. I think it is one of the most fake, artificially curated personas in Hollywood, and that is saying something. However, on the rare occasion, he does prove to be a very grounded actor who knows how to pull back the sarcastic, jokey persona when a scene requires emotional sincerity, such as Mississippi Grind, Buried, Smoking Aces, and The Voices. Compared to James Brolin, let's face it, even though the beard adds some maturity to him, Reynolds is still too much of a Hollywood pretty boy to personify that gritty 70s authoritative father figure.
Wacko family.
Although, when I rewatched a few scenes to try and put Reynolds at the back of my mind and look beyond my bias, I did honestly come to the conclusion that he is convincingly frightening at times. I think it's because, compared to the original, he has more physical interaction with his family, and the tensions between them are given more focus, specifically the fact that George is the children's stepfather, and as such, he's evidently more of an outcast who becomes a borderline intruder to them. Giving the children more presence in the film does help accentuate George's aggression, especially in one scene where he has the eldest son hold the wood while George chops, and frankly, I was waiting for the son to lose a finger or two.
We're friends. We're having fun, right? Put your hands up.
All I'll say is the wood chopping scenes are somehow even more anxiety inducing in the remake. In fact, he cuts so much wood compared to George in the original that I now want to see him compete with the father from The Witch to see who can build the biggest wood pile. Overall, the remake can be best summarized as somewhat deliberately mean-spirited. It's still just as inconsequential as the original, except we see more direct moments of harm come towards the family, and they even kill off the dog to try and get some more of that splatter provocativeness in there. And that's all I really have to say. I think if you can put aside its factual basis, the original is a strong and sometimes thought-provoking haunted house story, whereas the remake is the cinematic sensationalist equivalent. So if you've made it this far, I am incredibly grateful that you watched, and I hope you leave your thoughts on the films in the comments below. And until next time, stay safe, stay away from houses that have eyes, and I'll see you all very soon.